Hi guys, welcome to the channel. This is What If Goku Was in Fairy Tail. Before we start, remember to like and subscribe to help the channel. Also check the description for the creator of the fanfic. Chapter 30. Titania. The three ladies of Fairy Tail arrived at the dock just as the last boat was preparing to push off. Kana and Lucy were practically dragging Levy along between them. Her feet were barely moving and her head was rolling around with each step. All three girls looked worse for wear. Their clothes were shredded and Lucy and Levy both were bruised and bleeding. As the three made their way over, Simon jumped and rushed over. He took Levy from the two struggling girls and leapt back up to deposit her gently atop the deck before turning back to the others as they made their way up the boarding ramp. "Has there been any sign of Erza?" he asked. Kana groaned loudly and glanced around. "I was about to ask you the same thing. I was sure she'd be done with the tower nutjob by now. Goku might have just grabbed her and left with that cloud of his." Lucy reasoned. "It would probably be a lot faster than trying to climb all the way back down. We cannot risk it. I shall go after them," Simon declared. "Whoa, whoa, whoa," Miliana shouted as she leapt in front of Simon. "Do you remember how Jello trained us to use magic? Millie, do you?" "Millie, now's not the time, 'cause I do. He'd fight us until he was satisfied we were up to scratch. Do you remember how badly he'd always beat us? You know, all of us at the same time. If you go up there when he's actually trying to kill you, you'll die. For 7 years, I have stood by and done nothing to stop him. I will not do nothing now, I'm sorry." Then he was swallowed by shadows. "You'll forgive me if I'm a little furious," Jello said cheerfully. "It's just that, I had to spend years learning how to use rune magic so I could use that spell." Then came the preparation. Months were spent painstakingly painting out each and every line and infusing them with a careful, precise layer of magic to ensure the perfect amount of crippling, relentless pain could be activated with nothing but a thought. "I've kept it ready for you for so long, I couldn't wait to use it on you. The look on your face as you suffered was going to be exquisite." Jello sighed, frowning. "But then this idiot shows up and ruins it." Jalal's foot lashed out with enough force to send Goku sailing across the room. He didn't even react to the blow. His body was already locked in such incredible waves of pain that he could barely feel the impact. It did, however, snap Erza out of her shock. "Bastard." Purgatory's war club crashed into Jalal's shoulder hard enough to crack bone. Jello hissed in pain even as he dodged out of the way of the next swing and took to the air. Erza immediately switched into her Blackwing armor and followed him into the air, slashing relentlessly as she chased him around the room. 2 minutes left. He cackled after a particularly close blow left a stream of blood flowing down his cheek. Erza froze in midair before her eyes darted over towards Goku. "You are awfully quick to forget about those who depend on you, aren't you? It'd be a real shame if you failed to save a second friend atop this tower. I tried to save you, Jello. I put everything I had into trying to save you. People died following my lead because I made them fight their way to the top to shut this place down forever rather than letting them flee the moment we had a chance. And yet, if you had shown up 5 minutes sooner, I wouldn't have become what I am today. I guess your best isn't really all that impressive, is it?" Jello shook his head in mock disappointment. 1 minute to go. "I know that you'd never leave here with things as they are, but if you move quickly I'll let you save your friend. Then we can go down in flames together, just the two of us." Erza snarled and darted back across the room to Goku's side. The massive hole in the wall was just a couple yards away. All she had to do was toss him out of the tower and call for Nimbus. Everything else would sort itself out from there. But as Erza reached down to pick up her crippled friend, his hand shot out and grabbed her wrist. Brown eyes met, glassed over black, and Goku leaned forward even as his entire body trembled. "No chance," he hissed out. With Herculean effort he forced himself back up onto his feet and glared at Jello. A small yellow sphere of ki wobbled into existence in his palm, barely containing enough power to do more than light up the room. He turned to look Erza dead in the eye, forced another breath into his lungs. "Got your back." Getting rid of the magical council was painfully easy. The satellite was automated. Once they had punched in the coordinates, it was just a matter of waiting for it to move into position, charge up, and fire. The members had all retreated into their own chambers after the coordinates had been. Each and every one of them hoped that the solitude would help them come to terms with the fact that while they were undoubtedly taking out a serious threat, they were also eliminating potentially dozens of prisoners and slaves. Their reactions fell in line with Ultear's predictions perfectly. While majority of the magical council members were overall weaker than the wizard saints, they could still be a problem in a group. Separate though, Lost in their own thoughts and doubts, the hired help was more than enough to put a permanent stop to their meddling. Her newest round of hiring had resulted from quite a lot of good fortune. The group working with her at Galuna Island might have been defeated by Fairy Tail, but now the guild was steadily building quite the list of characters who would be more than willing to fight for her for the right cost. Her most recent acquisition alone would be enough to finish off the counselors. Bastard, shish. Don't try to talk, you'll only use up what little air you have left. Bellis sighed, calmly watching as the councilwoman finally collapsed to the ground and fell still. There you go, hope you find peace wherever you are now. 6 down, 2 to go. Bellis dispersed himself into air, casually letting himself drift through the doors and down the halls. Man, this job was such a downer. Killing old folks past their prime was no fun, little wonder that the boss lady had wanted someone else to do it. Bellis frowned to himself as he considered the lady in question. Ultear, pretty as a viper, and about half as nice. She'd approached him after that whole fiasco with his guild and Sleeping Beauty, telling him she'd been keeping an eye on Monkey Boy, because that wasn't creepy at all, and that she was impressed with his skill set. He'd wanted to say no. Ultear was about as shifty as a rat in a grain silo, but then she'd gone and offered him the one thing he truly wanted that he wasn't able to get on his own. The fact that she'd known what he'd wanted was also creepy as hell, but whatever, he was assassinating people, so who was he to judge? He stopped at a hallway junction. He knew the targets were in separate directions. He paused for a moment as panicking soldiers ran beneath and through him. He knew which way he wanted to go, but the question had to be asked, business or pleasure? Well, he had already killed 6 in the name of business, the last one could wait while he took some time to enjoy himself. He turned right. He let himself seep into the chamber of the head councilman, Crawford Seam. The overly fat man wasn't looking very good, sweat was pouring down his face as he spoke feverishly into a communication lacrima. Very quietly, Bellis blew the door shut and let himself materialize behind the councilman. Hello Crawford. Good heavens. The chairman jumped, spinning around with a feverish expression. Who are you? What are you doing in my chambers? He demanded. Who am I? Bellis grinned. I'm the one who is about to kill you. As for what I'm doing here, well, second verse same as the first. Crawford flinched and snapped his hands up, materializing a magic circle. Bellis was faster, twitching his fingers and creating a vacuum around the counselor's head. The sudden change jolted Crawford, causing the half-formed spell to dissipate into wisps of magic. He collapsed gasping. Why? Good question, I was hoping you would ask. Bellis replied, keeping his tone warm and friendly. My name is Bellis Vespers. Tell me, Chairman, does that name mean anything to you? Anything at all? Bellis stared into the man's wide uncomprehending eyes and snorted, shaking his head in disgust. Of course not. Well, since I'm not a very nice man, I need to make sure you know why that's important. Bellis crouched, smiling as he looked the chairman in the eyes. It started 20-odd years ago, in a little town named Montes Aires. Bellis paused, but the fat man's eyes still held no hint of recognition. Nice town, he continued. Small, inoffensive, no tourists, peaceful, till one day a group of dark mages came, called themselves the Last Gasp. Bellis smiled at the sudden glimmer of recognition. Ah, there it is. Now I'm ringing a bell. Well, the leader of these dark mages wasn't a very nice man. He had his cohorts set up a neat little magic circle around the town. Made a fancy barrier around the whole village. Nothing could get in, nothing could get out. Not even air. And now see here, I had nothing. Bellis snapped his fingers, lifting the chairman into the air and slamming him against the wall again. I wasn't done. Now that little village just so happened to be in possession of a distress beacon. They sent word out a cry for help and the Rune Knights came. Problem was it took them 3 days, the little town was pretty far away you see. Bellis sighed, I'm sure you'll agree that's a long time to go without air. Almost everyone died, but at least the Rune Knights arrived. They fell upon the dark mages and rounded them up in no time. They even caught the leader. The Rune Knights then searched the town for survivors and, wonder of wonders, they found one. A little boy, gasping and weak, but alive. They brought the mean old dark mage and the little boy back to city. They put the mage on trial and brought forth their key witness. The boy testified, grieving and weak, but determined. You see, everyone he had ever known was gone. His world was broken, but that little boy had a job to do. He had to get justice. Bellis clapped his fist into his palm for emphasis. If he made sure that the dark mage paid for what he'd done, maybe all his friends could live in peace. Bellis threw his hand over his eyes. But alas, the dark mage went free. Cleared of all charges. How did this happen? Well, he said it was the other dark mages who set him up as a scapegoat. Despite the little boy's testifying, despite his eyewitness account, the mage went free. I tell you, to this day, that little boy still remembers the sound of that mage laughing as he strutted out of the courtroom, proud as anything. The boy couldn't believe it, justice had slipped through his fingers. How? It took many years before he understood, but eventually he did. Bellis fell silent, staring at the squirming councilman. Tell me, oh esteemed chairman, he murmured, his voice as quiet as a windless day. Tell me, Crawford Seam, what was the dark mage's name? It was Alexander Seam. I didn't. Hush. Bellis waved his hand and what little air left in the room disappeared. He dropped the councilman and waited until the struggling stopped. Burn in hell. Bellis sighed one final time, he felt lighter, satisfied. He nodded to himself, then dissipated himself and left. He still had one more councilman to go, might as well get it over with. He flew himself down the halls, letting his mind go blank until he arrived at the right room. He blew himself through the cracks. I know you're there. Bellis blinked. The councilman, a short man with a black three-pointed hat, stared up at the air with a heavy frown. Wasn't that interesting? Even Monkey Boy hadn't been able to sense him when he turned to air. He didn't have the energy to create a sudden giant vacuum, so this one would require a delicate touch. He let himself materialize, gradually drawing the air from the room. Hello there, councilman. Were you expecting me? I'm a telepath. Would you care to explain why I just felt my link with the head chairman disappear? Because he's dead. Bellis shrugged. No point hiding it. Just like the other 6. I am aware of what has happened to them. And, you're just waiting for me. That's odd. Think you can beat me? No, I'm old, and I was never much for fighting. But I do have a question for you. Would you care to indulge me? Well, that's a weird thing to ask someone who just murdered your colleagues, but since you asked so nicely, fire away. You work for Ultear, don't you? Bellis said nothing, neither confirming nor denying. I thought so. The man collapsed. Bellis frowned. He hadn't drained the air that much yet. Why? The counselor's body flattened, turning into a shadow and sticking to the ground. The man began to move, slipping through a crack in the floor. Oh, hold up. Bellis hit the ground with a blast of air, but the man just kept moving on, unbothered. Behind Bellis, the door burst open. Rune Knights. Cease and desist. Aw man, that wasn't good. Bellis threw himself towards the window and slipped through the cracks as a barrage of containment spells shattered the glass behind him. Well, that was unfortunate. No doubt that councilman had surrounded himself with protective spells, too many for him to break through right now. He had failed. Oh well. He could appreciate the man's escape. Bellis had always felt that, as a general rule, there should always be at least one survivor for each act of genocide. Bellis shrugged to himself, and let himself blow away. Ultear would just have to be satisfied with 7 out of 8. Ultear frowned as she watched the tiny man escape, but there was nothing she could do about the fact. Just like she could do nothing about the fact that with Goku crippled she wouldn't be able to accurately assess his abilities. Instead, she turned towards one of the other monitoring orbs currently aimed up in space at the Etherian cannon. The charge had finally reached its maximum power, and from across the hall Seagrain was punching in the final authorization. It was finally time for things to really pick up. Even with Goku paralyzed, her hidden devices were still running countless scans and diagnostics of all varieties to break down the Jello. Goku, you're currently the best options I have to make my ambitions a reality. The harnessed power of the Etherian, or the ability to tap directly into a being's very life force. I need to know, or everything that I've done so far is useless. Come on boys, show me your powers. 60 seconds. Jello yawned. I guess you really are fine with your best friend dying with us, Erza. Maybe he can wave goodbye as you and I are dragged down to hell together. Despite herself, Erza let her eyes drift over towards her friend as she toyed with the idea of forcing him out of the tower. Erza's indecisiveness was all the opening Jello needed. A simple flare of his magic energy sent a fresh wave of pain surging through Goku's body. Gasping, Goku lost control of his energy sphere and it faded to nothingness as Jello dashed forward. He ducked underneath Erza's reflexive swing and came to a stop right in front of the twitching warrior. Goku tried to force his body to respond to the incoming danger, but he knew he was too slow. Far too slow. Jalal's fist buried itself into Goku's stomach that left him choking, coughing up blood even as Jalal swung around him and put the crippled fighter between himself and a furious Erza. 3, 2, 1, the world went white. Holy shit, Kana murmured as the giant pillar of white pure magic smashed down onto the tower from above. The sea around the point of impact began to boil and roll, sending the evacuation boats bouncing along atop the waves. The occupants of the boats were forced to shield their eyes as the massive wave of light rolled over them, a shining beacon that could be seen for miles in every direction. It hung to the air like a thick sheet, penetrating all the way through to the sea floor. It took several minutes for the blinding glare to die down enough that any of them could even think about opening their eyes. They weren't dead. That was the first pleasant surprise that Erza had gotten all day. Maybe. The entire tower had been transformed. Every scrap of metal was completely gone, replaced by blue crystal. Tiny sparks of energy were flying wild in every direction, bouncing along the floor and walls. Every time it made contact with her skin, she could feel her hair stand on end and her skin tense. As she stared at her surroundings, she felt a sudden chilly understanding run down her spine. This is a giant lacrima. Got it in one. Jelal smiled. It is impressive, isn't it? Resurrecting Zerf requires a massive power supply, far greater than anything I, or the original owners, could produce on my own. At least, not without the magical council finding out and sticking their noses in. But that's the beauty of this. If the magical council would stop us from getting the necessary power, then why not just get the council to give it to us themselves? That's insane. Etherian is made up of all of the elemental magic types fused together for a short burn attack. The magic is far too wild to be contained. You haven't made a resurrection machine, you've created a gigantic bomb. A bomb? Silly, naive, clueless Erza. This is only a bomb if we let it blow up. To fix it, all we need is a stabilizing agent. Something capable of reacting with the magic, of molding and directing it. I've never heard of anything capable of that, not on the scale this would require. Come now Erza, you're not thinking. I never said anything about an object. I already told you what the tattoo chains were originally for. Tell me, why do you think I spent so much time and effort on something to contain you? Erza's eyes widened for a brief moment before narrowing. You sick freak. I told you that you're the main event. Jelal sauntered around the room and stroked his finger across a crystal pillar that stood in the exact center. The crystal rippled like water under his touch before morphing to show Erza's reflection. It's like you said, Etherian is very unstable. But what I need isn't a thing, but a person. I need someone capable of handling the maelstrom of energy and with ease. Someone that can survive rapid changes in condition to their magical core with barely a pinch. Erza, I need you. He locked eyes with her reflection and Era was almost taken aback at the mad wonder shining in his face. It's honestly amazing, isn't it? For as much as you hate this place, you've sculpted yourself into the perfect final piece to complete my dreams. I doubt there is another person on the planet capable of this Erza, and believe me, I looked. But no, you are unique. All of the training you have done, all you have fought and strived for. Every single battle you have survived has brought you closer and closer to this exact moment. You've literally made yourself for this Erza, it is your destiny. Erza closed her eyes. Yes, now you can truly feel the awe of this place, can't you? Can you feel your fate approaching? Are you ready to embrace? With narious sound Erza threw herself forward and slammed her weapon into Jalal's back. The blade bounced off a hastily conjured a magic barrier just before she could cut him in half. He turned his head and stared at her with an almost remorseful expression. I see you still insist on fighting this. He sighed. Well, I suppose that this is to be expected. It always was a long shot that you would decide to side with me even after you discovered how closely tied you were to this place. But don't you feel guilty at all? Think of all the people that had to be hurt in order to finish this place. Are you really going to allow all of their suffering amount to nothing? How dare you? Erza's voice was as cold as a knife in a snowstorm. To join you would be to say that their suffering was right, was justified. I will never do that. I see. Well then, I guess we'll have to do this the hard way then. Isn't that right, Seagrain? Apparently so. Erza spun around to find herself face to face with what appeared to be Jalal's exact doppelganger. The man walked straight past her to stand beside the original with a huge grin. Erza, meet my, well, I suppose brother would be the acceptable word. This is the part of myself that I split off about 9 years ago to watch over the mainland for me. He was quite the agent, the guy even managed to get himself a spot on the magical council. Naturally he ate up a lot of my magical power. You can't become a counselor without some impressive feats of magic after all. But unfortunately for you, his job at the council is now no longer necessary. That means, now he can come back into the fold. The two men reached out to take one another's hands, and for the second time that day Erza was forced to hide her eyes as the room was bathed in a blinding glow. When the glow faded, the copy had vanished and Jello was left smirking at her. Then he turned to the side and fired off a bolt of light that burned a hole into Goku's shoulder. Goku roared in from his position on the ground, and the sudden surge of angry adrenaline allowed him to rise back up onto his feet. Jello merely grinned and flared his magic again, causing Goku to collapse before taking a single step. Erza was already moving to intercept when Jello pointed a finger charged with the same glowing energy directly at her friend's forehead. Right. Here's what's going to happen. You are going to get rid of that oh so scary purgatory armor, drop your weapons and embrace your destiny like the little lamb you are. Otherwise I'm going to blow a hole in your friend's head, beat within an inch of your life and throw you into the pillar. The choice is yours. Didn't we just do this? Goku groaned. I feel like we just did this. Well, I feel like you aren't in a position to be complaining right now. Jello replied. Erza, if you give up everything's just going to get even worse. You're the only one that can do this right now. You know, in your position I don't think you should be so quick to antagonize the person who's about to kill you. Meh, not the first time it's happened. Jello sighed in annoyance and bashed Goku over the top of his head. Goku took the blow with a smile as he eyed the other side of the room. It took Jello less than 2 seconds to look down, deliver the blow, and look back up at Erza again. In the time she re-equipped into her flight armor, dashed across the room and was mid-swing with her lightning spear by the time he finally noticed her approach. The man threw himself backward at a near 90-degree angle and Erza was able to lash out with her foot to knock Goku out of the way. Then finally the battle began. Oh geez, that doesn't look good, Lucy said as she watched the massive lacrima from the distance. Arcs of multicolor electricity were shooting off from across its entire length and minuscule cracks were beginning to form from the top down. How much longer do you think it's going to be before it falls apart at this rate? Kana wondered. It's not going to fall apart. Levi replied seriously. That lacrima looks dangerously unstable, and if it keeps crumbling like that it's going to explode. But judging by the current rate of decay I'd say we've got at least an hour to get out of the blast radius. So right now we should probably see if we can get Erza and Goku out of there. As Kana and Lucy looked to respond, a figure coated in a glowing yellow aura exploded out through the roof of the tower, firing tiny balls of light down beneath him the whole way. Erza was in hot pursuit with her Blackwing armor, deflecting every single hit that came near her off into the sea. The rest collided with the tower, creating brand new cracks with every impact. The girls both paused as they noted Levi's face get deathly pale. Lucy, Levi murmured, now don't take this the wrong way, but what are the chances of us surviving you summoning Aquarius to get us out of here? Kana and Lucy stared at the word mage for a moment before lunging for the oars. Erza was quickly discovering that an aerial battle was a terrible place to be a close combat specialist. Jello was laughing like a maniac as he flew around strafing her, and it was all she could do to block whatever he threw her way. Her blade was a blur of motion as she juked and dodged every which way in her first ever mid-air showdown. A trio of closely grouped balls of light somehow rushed up from her left side below her even as she tried to catch up to Jello, who had been flying up above her at the time. With a snarl she caught all 3 shots with the flat of her blade and launched them straight back at their owner. Jello rolled out of the way of the blasts with relative ease and launched a few shots back of his own. What followed was a horrible combination of tennis, dodgeball, and hot potato. Jello would fire more and more of the tiny projectiles, laughing like a madman, while Erza had to try to simultaneously knock enough back to keep Jello from getting too much of an advantage while dodging all of the blasts she wasn't in a position to dodge, while also making sure that she knocked all the attacks back in a manner that wouldn't just make them blow up in her face as soon as she touched them. Erza brought her blade up to intercept a sphere coming straight for her face and redirected it straight back up towards nothing. The redhead began looking around frantically for her opponent when suddenly she felt a pair of feet touch down onto the small of her back. She craned her neck around to see Jello crouched on top of her, one of her suit's wings in each hand. These sure to look important, he said cheerfully before giving a hard yank, and suddenly Erza was falling. With a snarl of annoyance she bathed herself in the bright glow of her re-equipped magic and brought forth her lightning empress armor. Twisting in midair she fired off a pair of lightning bolts from her decorative spear. The both went wide and Jello dove in to land a kick straight to her gut. Winded, Erza could do nothing but crash land heavily back through the roof of the tower. Jello landed lightly beside her, casually stomping the lightning spear in half as he touched down. He leaned back out of the way as an enormous was launched towards his face and hopped over a wave of flame launched from Erza's crimson blade as she switched to the Fire Empress armor. A wave of his hand created a whirlwind around the girl, snuffing out her fire and leaving her vulnerable to a point-blank blast. Erza groaned in pain as she was brought to her knees before steeling herself once more. Requip. Jello was forced into a mad scramble backwards as the Heaven's Wheel armor burst onto the scene with the presence of several dozen swords. Jello bobbed and weaved around the sudden bombardment, returning fire with his own bursts of magic that were quickly consumed by the endless stream of steel. Erza pressed forward, summoning even more blades, straining herself to her absolute limit as Jalal's defense grew more and more frantic. She began scoring hits, glancing blows only, but the number of oozing red rivets slowly increasing was a good sign. Jello hummed to himself when a claymore dug an inch-long groove into his forearm. Even as he continued to dodge around he watched as his blood slowly curled around his arm and dripped down to the ground. He looked up from the wound and locked eyes with Erza as she sneered across the room at him. Then he began to move forward. He moved through the barrage of swords like a ballerina, bending and twirling around each weapon as he closed the distance between them. At the sudden failure of her attack Erza switched tactics and launched herself forward to meet Jello in the middle of the room, her twin short swords gleaming. Jello ducked the first pair of cuts and shook his arm forward with a snap that sent an arc of his blood at Erza's eyes. Suddenly blind she reeled back and was left utterly defenseless as Jello put glowing hands onto her chest and blew apart another set of armor. See, that's the problem with fighting someone who's been studying your every move. They know how to get around your best techniques. I will admit it was a bit different actually being on the receiving end of it rather than just watching a recording, but I am nothing if not adaptable. Jello broke his monologue briefly to deliver a quick backhand to a charging Goku and activated the pain trigger once more. Once he was sure the fighter was sufficiently preoccupied he returned his attention to Erza and continued. Next is going to be the flight armor, right? Erza froze and the magic she had been started to gather for her next attack vanished. You'd blitz right for me only to pull off a quick turn to try and attack me from behind. Once I block that you'd proceed to go bouncing all over the room, coming in wherever you feel I might have a blind spot in a high-speed hit and run. Jello spread his arms wide and grinned. Come on and try, I dare you. Erza did nothing, glaring at him in loathing. Fine. That would leave you with the giant Amor, which is too slow and bulky to be effective against me, the Sea Empress armor which would be of no use to you this high above the water, and of course Purgatory. Well, that is, unless you want to break out the Seduction armor. I can't say that I would complain. How the hell do you even know that exists? Mirajane bought me that as a joke and it's never left my room. Well, I was curious about what kind of tricks you might have stashed away in your armor room. It's not my fault that the security at Fairy Hills is so poor. You have some very classy outfits stashed away, don't you, you naughty girl? But I digress, you only have one real option left. Are you prepared to surrender or would you rather go one more round? Erza let her magic speak for her. Pouring all of her rage into her power she brought forth her strongest armor once more. Thick, midnight black plates burst outward from the remains of the silvery metal. Her eyes burned red with her fury as she charged forward with her massive spiked sword lifted high overhead. Jello smiled as she approached and brought his hands up to counter moments before Erza's iron-clad boot crashed into his gut. Her elbow met his jaw hard enough to loosen teeth and her knee landed between his legs that left him bent over in pain. Scowling down at his hunched form she caught him across the temple with a backhand that sent him sprawling. The problem with memorizing patterns. You suddenly find yourself off balance when they are changed on you. Oh no. Jello drawled. You aren't doing exactly what I expected you to do. Whatever shall I do? He shook his head, a crooked grin crossing his face. You just don't get it, Erza. This is your strongest armor. Your last-ditch effort when everything else fails. Your back is against the wall, Erza dearest. But me, I've barely even gotten started. Jalal's entire body was suddenly alight in a surge of yellow energy and he vanished. Erza immediately swung around looking for her target only to feel a fist bury itself into her back right above the kidney. With a grunt she swung her sword around in a full circle only for Jello to duck the blow and catch her with a rising uppercut that left her stunned. Jello didn't give her a chance to recover. 3 explosive spheres crashed into her chest and blew her back across the room in a stream of smoke. She was back up like a shot, ducking the next wave of attacks and launching herself in the air to deliver a flying drop kick to the face. Jello groaned, but his eyes were alight with excitement. That's more like it. Come on, let's see how you handle this. Jello snapped his fingers and everything went dark. Erza steadied herself, blinking her eyes against the sudden darkness. Then there was a tiny dot of light, no bigger than her fist, floating in the void. It flashed and a beam of energy shot towards her. Erza lifted her club and batted away the light almost effortlessly. Is that it? She snorted, shaking her head in contempt. The blackness around her lit up with hundreds of lights. Erza's pupils shrank to pinpricks as they lights twinkled almost mockingly. Adamantium armor, she screamed, throwing up her strongest defense. She could feel the light raining down upon her shield, but nonetheless, she held strong. She felt the barrage of light slow to a trickle, then stop completely. Cautiously, Erza unfolded her armor and raised her head from behind her shield. Jalal's fist buried itself in her face, sending her crashing across the room. Do you know what your problem is? Jalal asked, sticking his hands behind his back and strolling forward. You put far too much faith in material things, more specifically, that armor you're so proud of. Jalal stopped, just out of striking range, and stared down at her with eyes like flecks of ice. Erza glared right back, blood running down her face. You're weak, Erza. Jalal murmured. A weak little girl, hiding behind a fortress of steel made by other men. He tilted his head to the side, eyeing her in consideration. Do you truly think that nobody notices? Go to hell. Erza spat. Delightful. I'm not like you, Erza. My strength is my own, my power is my own, my ambition is my own. And what do you have? Friends? Jalal scoffed, glancing over at Goku. We both know how you treat your friends. I'd bet you if I offered to take him for the tower instead of you, I would never accept such a thing. Erza hissed, attempting to force herself to her feet. No, I don't think you would. Jalal agreed. But if he offered himself up, you would do nothing but run away. Neve, you already did it once. Jalal's voice cut through her denial like a blade. You should accept your destiny with pride, Erza. I could strip your armor from you and toss you into the pillar like an unwanted piece of trash. But I do not want to. Jalal held out his hand, his eyes as soft and cold as freshly fallen snow. Come, Erza, accept your destiny with the dignity you deserve and I will spare your friend. I swear it. Erza muttered, staring at the hand, as soft and seductive as a swaying snake. Then a curtain of darkness rolled in. Jalal blinked as all of the light in the room was extinguished. He tilted his head to the side, listening carefully, straining his senses against the darkness for several moments. His arm snapped out, firing a single blast of light. There was a strangled gasp and suddenly the darkness drew back to reveal Simon kneeling against the ground, clutching his bleeding arm. Simon. Jalal sighed, shaking his head with an amused grin. Loyal to the very end. A pity you gave your loyalty to the wrong person. Jalal stepped forward, his boots clicking against the floor as he strolled around the downed mage. A pity too, that you are so stupid. I simply have to tell you, that you have the worst plans. Jalal sunk a glowing fist into Simon's back, breaking through skin and grinding bone to dust, then lifted him up and tossed him across the room. Jalal calmly lifted his hands to the sky and a wave of putrid power flooded the area, forcing Erza to shield her eyes as a whirlwind began to tear through the room. All around them shadows began to bend towards his spread hands, forming into a pulsating ball of black energy which seemed to suck the warmth right out of the air. I'm sorry, Simon, but this show only has room for 2 stars, you should have known better. Ultear. The sphere of chaos left Jalal's hands and Erza moved. There was no plan, just her muscles screaming in protest as she forced herself between her fallen friend and the encroaching death. She couldn't fail again. Not like this. She closed her eyes. Ha! The blue beam crashed into the black sphere like a bulldozer, pushing it straight through the crystal wall and out to sea. The entire tower shuddered as the shockwave hit and tiny pieces of the glowing ceiling began to rain down on their heads. Erza looked over in disbelief. Goku, down on one knee and with blood pouring down his hands, gave her half a weak and battered grin. Erza, you can't just give up, like that, he gasped. You haven't shown this guy what you're made of yet, after that, you can rest. The vein above Jalal's right eye began to twitch. How do you keep getting in my way? I don't know. Goku's bloody grin widened. Probably cause you keep not killing me. Jalal's twitch spread across his forehead. Good point. Goku's eyes hardened when Jalal's hand slow started to point towards his direction. Quietly he focused his ki, drawing up all of his reserves. Then, the moment that the symbols wrapped around his body were trigger, he cut loose. With a roar that was equal parts rage and agony, Goku erupted in a bright red aura. The crystal beneath his feet began to splinter in spider web-like fractures, and the tattoo began to warp even as it tortured him. Jello frowned at the sudden resistance and poured more magic into the bindings, causing them to blacken and vibrate violently. Goku's blood felt like molten lead pumping through his veins, but still he screamed, and the swirling aura around him only grew bigger and more violent. The room began to crumble more and more as the cracks spread, and Jalal's face went from puzzle to panic. You idiot. You're accelerating the destabilization. You're going to kill us all. Ha! Goku's muscles suddenly swelled, and with a final yell the tattoos caught fire. There was a horrible, gut-wrenching screech that filled the air, and a blinding flash of black and red nearly blinded everyone in the room. When the spots finally cleared from everyone's eyes, Jello let out a hiss of irritation. The explosion of energy had burned away Goku's shirt, and his pants weren't much better. One of his boots was smoking, and an armband lay on the ground covered in ash. His muscles looked like they had been forcefully inflated. His veins were popping out of his body so much that there was no way it wasn't painful. Despite all that though, Goku was back to grinning. The tattoos were gone. Cool, that worked. Goku murmured. Right. I think I'ma sit down a sec. Erza, you better win. Goku keeled over, his eyes glazed and unfocused. Erza looked at her friend worriedly for a moment before glancing over her shoulder to see Simon on the ground, bleeding from the back and unconscious. She couldn't tell if he was still breathing. She closed her eyes. What the hell did she think she was doing? How long was she going to stand back and let others save her? No more. Oh. Jello grinned, finally ready to accept your fate. Jello. Erza's voice was cold, not a hint of anger to be heard. No. Not Jello. Whatever you are. She opened her eyes. I'm going to kill you. It was not a threat. It was not boast. It was a promise. Again. We are really doing this again. Haven't we already done this enough? Erza's glare didn't falter. Her magic flared once more, steel plates melted off her. Red exercise pants decorated with flames on her legs, bandage wrappings across her chest, and a simple long sword in hand, Erza sunk into a combat stance. No armor this time, just some comfortable clothes. You tricks, no gimmicks, just my own magic filtered through my body completely naturally, unaltered in any way. That's what you're going with? Jello shook his head. Erza, darling, when I said you depend on those armors too much, I didn't mean. Shut up. Erza tightened her grip on her blade. This was it. No tricks, no tactics, and no preparation. Just him and her. Jello blinked, then scowled. You insignificant little witch, he snarled. You think you can just cast off who you are, just like that? I made you remember. I know you better than you know yourself. Everything you are comes from me, even your name. I own you, Erza, and nothing you do will ever change that. You have given me a name, yes, but I have earned others. I am the youngest S-class mage of Fairy Tail in 2 decades. I am the queen of Fairy Tail, the Titania, and I will not live in fear of you anymore. Jello brought up his arm and unleashed a bolt of pure white magic that screamed out towards Erza. Jalal's smirk vanished though when the attack blasted right through her after image. Erza came blazing down from the ceiling, landing hard straight on top of Jalal's shoulders. He didn't even have a moment to start to fall over before she wrapped her thighs around his throat and was twisting, pulling him straight down nose first into the ground. With her legs still in place, she pulled herself up into a handstand, dragging Jello along with her before she began to spin. Once, twice, 3 times, and suddenly Jello found himself airborne. Twisting himself around, he managed to bounce, land feet first on one of the support pillars, and kicked off straight back toward the red head. His fist crashed into her jaw and an arc of blood escaped her lips. But Erza used the momentum from the blow to throw herself into a spin, driving the hilt of her sword into his gut. Jello folded over in pain only for Erza's elbow to slam into his nose with a sickening crack. A small river of crimson began pouring down from his face and Jello snarled through the blood clogging his throat. Grabbing Erza by the hair, he made to yank her downward. Her sword flashed, and his hand went flying off in a fountain of blood. Jello lost his balance as she swept his leg out from under him and the two toppled to the ground with Erza on top. Jello raised his remaining hand to blast her off, but her sword sunk into his shoulder, sending his aim wide. More cracks began to spread around the room and chunks of lacrima began to fall. The tower shook like a tree in a hurricane as the magic began to spit out in geysers from all up and down its length, and the sea began to boil around the base. A violent shudder threw Erza off balance, allowing Jello to shoot up back to his feet once more. Enough. Jalal's hand and bleeding stump were crossed above his head and the whirlwind of black magic burst back into life. Erza still charged in, sword in hand, and with all her might she brought the weapon down. Jalal's chest sprayed red as her blade tore into his front and the magic vanished just as quickly as it had appeared. The two foes, former friends, met each other's gaze one last time. Then with a final roar Erza's foot shot out, kicking Jello full on in the chest and propelling him straight back into the liquid crystal center of the room. The man crashed into the surface and disappeared in a glowing ripple. Erza took a moment to breathe. The fight was over. Everything was over. More than anything, Erza wanted to sit down and let everything sink in. She wanted to process what she had just done, and what she had freed herself from. But she'd have to make sure there was time for that, first. She spun around and dashed back over towards her friends. She grabbed Goku and Simon, throwing them over her shoulders as she staggered to the edge of the room, gazing out at the long fall to the ocean. That wasn't good. With Goku unconscious, there was no way to call Nimbus. Well, she hadn't come this far just to die. Erza closed her eyes and jumped. Far away, in a secluded room of magical scrolls and elegant drapes, Ultear sat. Gazing into the crystalline ball, she sighed to herself as Tower of Heaven collapsed in on itself. Well, she had her answer, she supposed. Well, no, she didn't. Goku been removed from the fight before it could truly begin. So rather than having the answer, her choices had forcibly cut down to one. A pity. Still, she wasn't going to let that stop her from achieving her goals. 8 of the 10 counselors of magic had been removed, the government of Fury was in disarray. Even if they could gather themselves quickly enough, they'd be too busy dealing with the political fallout of firing Etherian in their neighbor's country. She'd be impressed if they were even able to prevent all-out war to begin with. My, she could practically hear the toxic conspiracies and threats beginning to circulate even now. Just the thought of it made her tingle. But there would be time, time, for her to revel in her power later. As of the moment, she had best make use of the turmoil to acquire several assets. She grinned to herself, and picked up a teleportation scroll. Sending a spark of magic through the paper, she winked out of existence, reappearing in a dark corridor beneath the capital. Normally, such a feat would be impossible. The capital of magic had been host to an endless number of protective magic woven and rewoven into the stone for centuries. It was merely fortunate that the mages who had first created such spells had designed them to need to be renewed over the years, and as such, they had a time limit. Ultear tittered to herself. She really shouldn't mock them. It was exactly that kind of short-sighted foolishness that she owed her success to. She floated a rock up to her hand, threw it back into a time when it had been molten, casting her surroundings into a dim orange light. Ah yes, there were the stairs. Hitching up her kimono, she delicately stepped down into the deep. She knew this place well. It was where the council sent individuals they wished removed, but simply had too much political or economic clout to be completely discarded. The fact that some of those people may have been obstacles to her personal goals was just a detail. She worked her way down past the political prisoners, uncaring if they saw her. Nobody important ever came down here, let alone listen to anything these forgotten souls had to say. Finally she arrived at her destination, the magic cells, home to prisoners whose magical ability were simply too strong to contain without the capital's layered securities. And, yes, here was the one she wanted. She held up the ball of lava, illuminating the huddled form of a man against the far wall. The shadows said you'd come. The man's voice was ragged, as though something had been taking chunks out of it. Did they? And did they tell you what I had to offer? No. The man looked up, and my, didn't he look much the worse for wear. His normally impeccably groomed face was ragged, and without his fine clothes he seemed far less imposing. Smaller. Ultear wasn't fooled. Without the magical cuffs around his wrists and ankles, she knew he could likely kill everyone in the capital. What if I told you that I was offering you a chance for revenge? His face still cast in shadow, Jose grinned. Thanks for listening. If you want the next part of this video, be sure to like, subscribe and comment and hit that bell notification. See you next time.